For 150 years, gray squirrels won. Every forest, every red squirrel stronghold, every conservation budget thrown at the problem. They won all of it. Then, in a handful of Irish woodlands, something happened that made no sense. No poison went down. No trapping team moved in. No new law was passed. No one spent a single euro on it. And yet, on camera traps checked year after year, gray squirrel sightings just started collapsing. Researchers checked the data twice, then a third time. Because the forest hadn't been managed. It had been changed by something that was already living inside it. An animal so quiet that most people didn't even know it had come back. 3 seconds, that's all the footage shows. Then it's gone, back into the dark between the trees. That 3-second shadow is the reason gray squirrels are now losing ground in Britain and Ireland, after a century and a half of undefeated conquest. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one recovering predator quietly undid 150 years of damage, without anyone planning it, funding it, or even noticing it was happening, until the numbers forced them to look. This is the story of the animal that refused to let the invasion stand. Gray squirrels arrived in Britain from North America in 1876. The first animals were released at Henbury Park in Cheshire by a landowner who thought they'd make a decorative addition to his estate. He had no idea what he was starting. They spread slowly at first, hedgerows, woodland corridors, then faster. Then, with the unstoppable consistency of a species that had found a system it was perfectly built for, and that had nothing left to resist it. By the end of the 20th century, gray squirrels occupied roughly 3/4 of their potential range across the UK. Red squirrels, animals that had lived in these woodlands since the last ice age, were pushed into a few northern Scottish strongholds, scattered pockets of northern England, and isolated pockets of Ireland. The response was the obvious one: trap, cull, repeat, control zones, supplementary feeding stations to help red squirrels compete, disease monitoring for squirrelpox. A virus gray squirrels carry without symptoms, and that kills red squirrels within weeks. Millions of pounds and euros, decades of organized effort, and it worked while it was funded. The moment a program lost its budget or its team got reassigned, the gray squirrels came back, without exception. Every time. It wasn't incompetence, it was the wrong target. Everyone was attacking the symptom. The actual cause had been hiding in plain sight for 300 years, before the first gray squirrel ever touched British soil. The gray squirrel didn't win because it was smarter or tougher. It won because it walked into a broken system. A system missing a piece that had been removed 3 centuries before it arrived. The pine marten, Martes martes, is native to Britain and Ireland. It belongs here the way the red squirrel belongs here. The way the old oak forests belong here, a low, nocturnal member of the weasel family, quick enough to take a rabbit, patient enough to raid a nest. For thousands of years, it shared these woods with red squirrels, successfully, across millennia. Then came the fur trade. Then came centuries of gamekeepers on shooting estates classing pine martens as vermin, trapped, shot, poisoned. By the early 20th century, they'd been wiped out of nearly all of England and Wales, reduced to a remnant in the remote Scottish Highlands and a few pockets of rural Ireland. Nobody connected that loss to squirrels. Why would they? The predator vanished a century before the invasion even began. But the two events stacked on top of each other, and the damage compounded. An invasive species with no natural enemy, entering a landscape where its one possible check had already been dismantled. People looking at British woodlands in the mid-20th century thought they were watching a fair fight between 2 squirrel species. They weren't. They were watching the result of 2 separate human failures, and almost nobody alive remembered what the forest looked like before either one happened. The broken version was the only version anyone knew, which is how a researcher named Dr. Emma Sheehy ended up staring at numbers that made no sense. Sheehy wasn't trying to rehabilitate the pine marten's reputation. She was working through gray squirrel population data across Irish woodland sites, trying to understand shifts in distribution, and she kept hitting the same pattern. In certain sites, gray squirrel numbers were falling with 0 active management. No poison, no traps, no culling. And in those same sites, pine marten camera trap detections were noticeably higher than in comparison sites where gray squirrels were stable or growing. She didn't accept it right away. She ruled out food availability, woodland structure, localized disease. She controlled for everything she could access. The pine marten signal held, consistent, statistically significant, same direction, every site. She published the findings in 2018 in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, under a title that made no attempt at subtlety. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. More pine martens, fewer gray squirrels. And in the same areas, red squirrels recovering into the space that opened up. Conservationists were cautious, reasonably. Pine martens eat both squirrel species. Wouldn't a generalist predator just suppress everything equally? That's exactly where the story gets interesting. The pine marten and the red squirrel have shared these forests for thousands of years, long enough for evolution to quietly write a survival manual neither species is aware of. The red squirrel is small, light, fast in the high canopy, and appears to carry behavioral wiring shaped by millennia of marten pressure, vigilance, escape routes, evolved caution. The gray squirrel evolved across millions of years in North America, a continent with no pine martens at all. It has zero fear response. No instinct fires when it smells marten scent on a log. It forages heavily on the ground, exactly where pine martens hunt best. And it behaves like an animal that genuinely has no idea what's approaching. A pine marten doesn't need to hunt down every gray squirrel in its territory. It just needs to reduce breeding success enough that the population can't replace itself. Kits taken, nests raided, recruitment dropping below the line. The gray squirrel population can't grow fast enough to hold its ground. Meanwhile, the red squirrel, lighter and harder to catch, keeps breeding into the space that opens up. The marten isn't running a strategy. It's just hunting the easier prey. That asymmetry, an evolutionary accident from the red squirrel's point of view, looks in practice exactly like the forest putting itself back together. And here's the part almost nobody was tracking in real time. Pine martens were legally protected in Ireland in 1976, and in Britain in 1981. The persecution stopped, and from whatever tiny surviving population remained in the remotest corners of the map, pine martens began, slowly, invisibly, to recover, with no one coordinating it. No budget line, no plan. The Irish findings weren't a one-off. Similar patterns started appearing in Scottish woodland monitoring, messier, because gray squirrels have been established there far longer, and the habitat is more varied, but pointing the same direction. That's not a weakness in the theory. That's what a real ecological mechanism looks like when it gets tested against a landscape that isn't identical. In Wales, the Vincent Wildlife Trust had already begun physically reintroducing pine martens in 2015, relocating individuals from Scottish populations into Welsh woodland, where the species had been functionally absent for most of the 20th century. Early monitoring has tracked in the same direction as Ireland. One discovery, one corroboration. One active reintroduction. That's how a real ecological principle spreads, not with a single triumphant result, but with the same story quietly beginning again in a third place. And in the highest marten density Irish sites, researchers found something nobody had promised going in. Red squirrels weren't just surviving, they were actively recovering, breeding, dispersing, recolonizing woodland they'd retreated from decades earlier, in zones with no supplementary feeding. No parallel culling, none of the intervention infrastructure conservationists had assumed for 50 years was the bare minimum required. The competitive pressure dropped because the predator that had always kept it in check came home. This doesn't work everywhere, and it's only believable if we say that plainly. Pine martens need woodland large and connected enough to hold territories. They need legal protection that's actually enforced. Illegal persecution still continues on some shooting estates. And where it does, recovery stalls. Squirrelpox still circulates in the landscape. Martens reduce the gray squirrel population that carries it, but they don't eliminate the virus. In fragmented urban or heavily farmed landscapes, this model simply doesn't apply. The places where it works are the places where the conditions lined up. Protection in force long enough for numbers to rebuild, woodland intact enough to hold territories, and a gray squirrel population that hadn't yet locked in so deeply that a recovering predator couldn't tip the balance. Compare the two approaches. Decades of culling programs needed continuous staff, continuous funding, and produced results that evaporated the moment anyone stopped paying for them. The pine marten's comeback in Ireland happened because a law passed in 1976 simply stopped the killing. No deployment, no maintenance budget. The forest found the predator, and the predator found the forest. and a relationship that had run for thousands of years before anyone interrupted it quietly started working again. There's a camera trap in an Irish woodland tonight, mounted on a log at the edge of a stand of old oak. Somewhere in the next few hours, a pine marten will cross that frame, low, fast, gone before the shutter finishes cycling. In that same wood, gray squirrel activity is a fraction of what it was 10 years ago. Red squirrel prints are showing up in the soft mud again. No trapping team came through here. No poison was laid. No budget was spent. For 150 years, Britain and Ireland tried to solve the gray squirrel problem by attacking the gray squirrel. The animal that refused to let them win was already living in the forest. It just needed people to stop killing it.